to the Wormhole Podcast, episode 21. Joining me today is the author of two short story collections, The Ugliest House in the World and Equal Love, and the novels, The Welsh Girl and The Fortunes, the first longlisted for the Man Booker and a Richard and Judy Book Club pick, and the second winner of the Ainsfield Wolf Award and the Chautauqua Prize. Hello, Peter Ho Davies.
Hi, good to be here, Charlie.
How are you?
I'm good, yeah. Well, I mean, as good as anybody can be in these very strange times that we're living through.
So I'm going to get to your books in a moment, but tell us about your background and your journey to publication.
Well, boy, that's, now that I'm in my mid-50s, it's a fairly long story. But I was born in Coventry, so I grew up in Britain, went to college in Manchester, actually when I was trying to be a physicist, so that's my first degree. Then went on to college at Cambridge, worked a little bit in publishing in Britain and elsewhere, and then came to the US in the early 90s to go to a graduate program in creative writing. Met my wife there and have basically been living in the US ever since. I think maybe just a year or two ago, I sort of tipped over. I got to the point where I'd spent more than half my life in the US. Long time as a green card holder, and just in the last year or two as a citizen, I finally decided to take that plunge. And, started as a short story writer. And one of the reasons I think I stayed in the US is because there was a good market for short stories, and I was able to get teaching work here, which has gradually increased as time has gone on. So now I'm a professor, still odd to say that, of creative writing at the University of Michigan, where I've now been, crazily enough, for 20 years, although I guess the fact that the time has passed quickly means that I've been enjoying it mostly.
Well, I do have a question. What courses do you teach?
So I mostly teach creative writing workshops. We have a pretty well-established graduate program here, so I'm very lucky to work with really talented young writers. And so I usually teach a workshop to those guys once a year. I usually teach one or two undergraduate workshops as well. And again, I'm lucky to have very good undergraduates here too. And then usually a literature class or two as well. So I'm in the throes right now preparing to teach a class in what I call the very contemporary novel. We look at books over the last 5 or 10 years or so. And it's kind of fun. It's a bigger class. It's like 40 or 50 undergraduates. The workshops are small at 10 to 12 people. And it's a little bit more performative. It brings out the inner ham in me a little bit, but it's a lot of fun to talk about that. And, it's actually, for me, almost an experiment of sorts, talking to young undergraduates about contemporary novels, what they enjoy about them, what they like about them. It's sort of like market research for me a little bit as a novelist. And, I'm very upfront with them. They know that I'm a novelist as well. I think it's interesting for them to talk about literature with a practitioner. I don't have a PhD, so in many ways I'm less qualified than most of the English faculty in the department. But I think in a way that gives them a different take, and I think they find it refreshing and interesting and fun, I hope, as well.
So I noted you said you started writing after you'd moved to America. Was Britain not inspiring at all, or?
Oh, no, I'd done a little bit of writing in Britain. I had done a fair bit. And I think, like a lot of writers who go on to take a course in creative writing, nearly all of my students would fall into this category as well. We're all people who feel guilty that we're not writing enough, right? Or we feel we're struggling to make time for it amidst life or studies or work. And so the idea of going to a program or a course where somebody's going to encourage you to do it is going to be your primary focus for a while. All of those things, I think, sort of build on and answer that guilt we have for not writing enough in lots of ways. So I've done some writing in Britain. That larger question, though, about whether or not I find Britain inspiring, it's odd, I mean, there's a long tradition of expatriate and in some cases exile and refugee writers, of course. And I think often for those writers, there's an opportunity when you're away from the home space to write back into that place. So I think when I first got to the US, and right through the Welsh Girl, really, I was writing a lot of Britain, but enjoying the slightly distant perspective, thinking about Britain from afar felt useful to the work, I think, for me. But there's also probably a sense in which, it's funny, we're at that moment now in the pandemic where we're about to welcome a new group of graduate students, even though a lot of the classes we'll be offering will probably be remote. And I was, of course, as we do now, Zooming with them a couple of months ago and asking, do you think you'll actually move to town, or will you delay your move since the classes will probably be remote? And a lot of them were talking about how they would move because I think, well, partly because I think they're in their parents' basements in some instances at the moment. But I think it's that feeling of, I want to move to the place where I'm going to begin my life as a writer, where I'm going to be around other people who think of me as a writer and around other people who are writers. And I think, at least where I grew up in Britain, Coventry, while I pretty happy childhood, good teachers, my parents were pretty supportive. It felt hard to imagine myself as a writer in that space because everybody around me knew me as, well, as a physics student or as their son or whatever it might be. And I don't think we knew anybody who was or aspired to be a writer. So that act of reinvention felt a little tricky in the space of anticipated skepticism of others and more truly my own inner skepticism, I think, in various ways. So to come to a new place is a little opportunity of reinvention, and nobody else knows you as anything other than this person who's trying to be a writer. And that was sort of empowering, I think, to me in some ways and helped me get over some of those. I mean, there are very many of these doubts and reticences about trying to be a writer.
That's interesting to hear. So I'm just going to ask a single question, but obviously you tell us what you'd like to. Tell us about Equal Love and the Ugliest House in the World.
Oh, golly. Well, so this is my first two books, both of them collections of short stories. And I still am very attached to the form of the short story. And I think the form somehow is still informing even the novels that I'm writing in quietly subterranean ways. I think we might talk about that as we go on. And what I would say, because I think often for British readers, I feel like the short story form is a little less popular, a little less visible. There are fewer magazines and outlets for it, I think, in Britain, or at least there were when I was coming up. And so I often have to think about what is the form of the short story collection. It looks like a novel, right? But it doesn't quack like a duck exactly the same way, right? So I would say The Ugliest House in the World, because it's the first book, and I was lucky to be able to publish it at a point in the publishing cycle where this was still commercially viable. It's sort of like that book where you say, this is all the good stuff I happen to have right now, right? So it's kind of a real grab bag of a collection. But I love that aesthetically, it's really exciting to write short stories, to try and do a different thing with every single story, every month or every couple of months, you're trying out a different voice, a different time period, a different style. Whereas if you're engaged in a novel, very often you're locked into certain choices for years on end. So there's a real thrill to me in writing a short story. And probably as somebody, with a British background, living in the US, with a Chinese mother, a Welsh father, I felt like I had a lot of very different stories to tell. And so the capaciousness of the short story form seemed really inviting to me in those regards as well. Equal Love is a slightly different kind of collection because it is more tightly themed. It's sort of interested in the idea of relations between parents and children. It takes its title from a Forster quote. And so although the stories again have a lot of that range, I hope, there's a kind of thematic interest in the dynamics between parents and children. And the children in the text range from very young children to becoming parents themselves, to becoming people who are caring for their own elderly parents. So there's a kind of generational sweep to the collection as well. So even though the stories are distinct, I hope there's some threads through it that also make sense for the reader.
Okay, so listeners, I've mentioned the 4 books in the intro, but we are going to concentrate further on the novels today. The Welsh Girl is set around the Allied invasion during the Second World War and looks at questions of loyalty to oneself and nationally, and as well a little bit on courage. It follows 3 characters in different chapters. You've got investigator Rotherham, who is German, and to the Nazis, he's Jewish. Esther, a young Welsh woman living near a camp who is assaulted by a man she's seeing, and she starts questioning life and the war. And then you've got Carsten, who surrenders to the British on behalf of his fellows in France. And Peter, you have a reading from the start of the book for us.
Sure, yeah. Hopefully this won't need too much setup. It's the very first 3 or 4 pages from the book and features Rotherham and one of the other major characters. Here we go. This is from the prologue. It's September 1944. Outside, the Technicolor sunset is giving way to the silvery sweep of searchlights over distant Cardiff as a hand tugs the blackout curtain across the sky. There's a scraping of chairs and the snap of a switch as the projector starts up. The room fills with the sharp chemical smell of acetate, the ionized stink of scorched dust. Lights, Rotherham calls, and the lamps are extinguished. On the makeshift screen, a bedsheet tacked to the wall, ironed creases still visible. An image blooms, blurred at first and then twisted into focus. Clouds, wispy cotton wool clouds slide across the screen, and then the camera dips beneath them, and there's the city spread out like a map. The screen fills with Gothic script, Triumph des Willen, and beneath it in shaky subtitles, Triumph of the Will. The watching men flicker in the reflected light. They're seated in a rough semicircle, a handful of dining chairs flanking a cracked leather armchair. Only the armchair faces the screen squarely. The men in the dining chairs are half turned from the film, looking back toward the projector, their eyes narrowed against its glare, studying the figure at their center. On the screen, behind them, Adolf Hitler rides through the streets of Nuremberg in an open car. Crowds throng the side of the road, arms thrusting into the air, the salute rising and falling like a great wave. In the car, the Führer himself holds his arm up, not at the same sharp angle as the rest, but tipped back at the wrist, fingers slightly arched as if balancing a silver salver. The screen dissolves to a shot of Hitler on a podium as a battalion of men, glinting spades on their shoulders, march past in powdery sunlight. Beside, and a little behind him on the stage, is a severely handsome man, slimmer and taller than the Führer. In the next scene, the same figure is at a lectern, a glinting microphone before him, passionately exhorting the crowd. His hand saws the air. A shining lock of hair falls across his brow. He ends his speech crying Sieg Heil over and over and over until the crowd rings with it. The reel runs out, and as the film is being changed, a hand reaches out of the gloom and offers the figure in the armchair a cigarette. He fumbles it out of the pack and bows his head to take a light. There is the flash, then flutter of flame, and in it his face is momentarily visible. Older, gaunter, and more disheveled, it is still recognizably the man from the screen, Rudolf Hess, former Deputy Führer of the Third Reich. The film had been Rotherham's idea. He'd seen it first in 1936 in Berlin, taking a tram across town to a cinema in a district where he didn't think anyone would know him, not telling his mother where he was going. She had been pressing for them to leave Germany for months by then, ever since his grandparents had fled to France the previous year. But they're Jewish, he told her, as if she might have overlooked the fact. It's disgraceful how they've been hounded, but we aren't. His father, long dead, had been, but his mother was the daughter of German Lutherans who'd settled in Canada and made a fortune in timber. They'd sent her back to the motherland to study in Göttingen, where she'd met his father in 1912. In the eyes of Jews, the eyes of his father's family, say, who had spurned his marriage and supported his son and widow only from a distance, Rotherham wasn't one of them. Yet in the eyes of the Nazis, he was, a Mischling at least, a half-Jew. He'd been dead set against leaving, even after seeing a fellow beaten in the streets. It had happened so fast. The slap of the running feet, a man rounding the corner, hand on his hat, chased by three others. Rotherham had no idea what was going on, even as the boots went in, and then it was over. The thugs charging off, their victim curled on the wet cobbles. It was a busy street, and no one moved, just watched the man roll onto one knee, pause for a moment, taking stock of his injuries, then pull himself to his feet and limp hurriedly away, not looking at any of them. As if ashamed, Rotherham thought. He barely realized what was happening, yet he felt as if he'd failed. Not a test of courage, not that, he told himself, but a test of comprehension. He felt stupid standing there gawking like all the rest, too slow on the uptake to have time to fear for himself. But when he told his mother, she clutched his hand and made him promise not to get involved in such things. He shook her off in disgust, repeated that he hadn't been afraid, but she told him simply, "You should have been." So he had gone to see the film the next week to prove something. He arrived early and slipped into a seat toward the rear, hoping it would be a small crowd, but by the time the main feature began, the theater was full. He sat through the first half hour, his shoulders hunched, his arms crossed tightly to avoid any contact with the fellows sitting on either side of him. They were with their girlfriends. It had been a mistake to sit near the back, and when, after about 10 minutes, the boy to his left started to kiss his girl, Rotherham didn't know what was making him more uncomfortable, the film or the couple. He was actually grateful when someone behind them harumphed loudly, "Show some respect." When 20 minutes later the boy on his right tried something, Rotherham distinctly heard the girl slap the fellow's hand away. By then, though, he was caught up in the film, its ecstatic pageantry. The fervent masses on the screen seemed to merge with the crowd around him in the theater. It might have been the two couples flanking him, but by the time the film was over, he felt violently lonely. He wanted to have even a bit part in this great drama. For a brief while in the darkened cinema, invisible in his seat, he felt as if he did. But then the lights came up, and he hurried out, panicked by the sudden piercing thought that if he could, he would want nothing more than to join the Nazis. In his haste, he trod on the toes of one of the girls, fleeing before he could apologize, fleeing from her little hiss of anger, her pointing finger. Outside, he must have run half a mile, feeling as if the crowd were at his back, ready to kill him for stepping on some girl's toes. That was the day he realized he and his mother would have to leave.
Thank you.
Oh, sure, thanks.
I have a question about a sentence that you read near the end of that, but the lights came up and he hurried out. What was it like writing that sentence?
You always, I'm sort of a great movie goer and sort of beguiled by that experience, and have found occasionally great solace in just being in a darkened movie house. If I've been traveling, say, overseas, it's a kind of a portal back to places you might know if you watch an American movie or a British movie. But there's a moment, I think, when the spell is broken, right? When the lights come up. I used to, as a kid, actually go to matinees all the time, and you'd stumble outdoors, and, the blinding sunlight, your eyeballs would literally hurt. So there's something about that moment that feels like a moment of exposure and also a moment of waking from a dream. In this case, watching a Nazi propaganda film like Triumph of the Will, the dream is a nightmare in a certain sense, and yet still beguiling. So I think there was a number of those things that I was thinking about as I was sort of processing the sequence at the end of that passage.
Because I know I got to there, and obviously we're just getting a hold of who Rotherham is, and it's this whole book, we're just getting into it. And I was just so shocked by that sentence. I had to take a few moments to really take it in and think, my goodness. Yeah, so that's interesting to hear. So you 3 characters. Who was the most important to you to write about?
That's a good question. They vied for my attention. The Welsh Girl was a book a long time in the writing. It was my first novel. I was still, I think, moving from that space of being a short story writer to being a novelist, which is often a slightly tricky transition. One of the ways I often write short stories is in sort of short, fairly discontinuous bursts. Writing them is very well suited to a kind of itinerant writing life where you might pitch up in a town for a year or so and then move on to the next one. They're a good form for that kind of lifestyle. With the novel, it felt very problematic to work on it in short bursts. I was, I think, starting teaching at that point. And so I think I wrote a big chunk of it one summer. And then once the semester and the teaching load got very busy as I got into the autumn, I just put the novel aside, and it probably stayed aside for months on end. And when I came back to it the next summer, you sort of feel like you've lost the thread a little bit. You want to start somewhere else, something else to get you excited about. And so whereas I'd started very much focused on Esther, I think when I came back to the material 6 months or a year later, I became interested in the fate of the German prisoners, the POWs, and so I did a lot of research about them. And Carsten's experience became of interest to me at that stage. And of course, once we're thinking about German prisoners of war in Wales in that period at the end of the war, the story of Hess's incarceration in more like South Wales came to the fore, and that became very interesting to me as well. So it felt as though I got fired up by 2 or 3 different pockets of material in a way. And one of the struggles as the book went on was beginning to blend those spaces. There were times when I felt it would be more one way or the other. I hope now it's mostly Esther and Carsten's narrative, but Rotherham feels like an important character to sort of wrap around that story to give it a little bit more scope, because he can reach out to the experience of being in Germany. He can reach out a little bit to the Jewish experience in some ways. By touching on Hess, he's not just talking about the German prisoners of war, who are the men who took the orders, but he's talking a little bit also about a man who gave some of those orders.
Mm-hmm. So what led you to think about writing about, if I call it the D-Day period?
Well, I think the initial impetus was, I'd written a few stories set in North Wales, which is where my father is from, and enjoyed writing about that space. It felt like a space that I wasn't reading a lot about, or not a lot of contemporary work about, at least. So it felt like really interesting material to explore, and it felt like a space that I felt like I had an emotional connection to. But I was very aware that for American readers, but also I think to some degree for British readers as well, North Wales can feel like a pretty remote place. It's isolated, it's sort of tucked away. It's not like writing about London. Why would we read stories set there? And so from time to time, different parts of the material had spoken to me. I think I have a story about the Welsh community in Patagonia encountering Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. And so there's an odd way there that the remoteness of Welshness is bumping up against this odd sort of cinematic global fame, I suppose. I even have a story that, although it doesn't really now feature Wales, sort of began because I was doing some research about UFO sightings in Wales. And there's some logic there that says, well, if aliens find Wales interesting, surely American readers will, right? So there's part of that going on. What I think drew me to the material of the Welsh Girl is two things. It's one, it's that idea that at this point of the war, German prisoners of war were being held in remote camps in Britain. There were some in Scotland and in northern England as well, but in Wales. So the very remoteness of Wales becomes interesting at that point. And in fact, I think treasures from the National Gallery were stored in northern Wales in some of the slate mines. So this idea of the remoteness becomes actually attractive. It's like the world comes to this remote part of North Wales in a certain sense. So I was intrigued by that. I think I was intrigued also by the collision of what I think of as a benign patriotism and nationalism, Welsh nationalism in North Wales, the desire to preserve the language things, with this most evil form of nationalism that we associate with National Socialism, with the Nazis. Those two things bumping up against each other seemed really interesting. And then it also goes back to a kind of childhood memory. My grandmother, who lived in North Wales for many years and used to visit on, I must admit, endless, to my mind as a child, and rather dreary summer holidays because it was always raining. She had on her mantelpiece a number of sort of small kind of handmade ornaments. They were sort of made out of brass. She would polish them every so often. Sometimes I might even help her as a child. And, one of them was a little brass cigarette box. Another was a letter opener in the shape of a sword. There might have been a few other items, an ashtray, I'm sure, probably in that space. And at some point in my childhood, I understood that these had been made from spent shell casings by prisoners of war, that to pass the time they had made these things. And it just became interesting to think about how might some of these objects end up in the hands of a Welsh woman who would have been young at that time. And I'm not sure what the provenance of them was for my grandmother, but that was a way of beginning to think about Esther and those images of her maybe exchanging items with prisoners through the fence, or as I began to learn, the idea that prisoners at the end of the war were also coming to work on local farms. Some of them even met and married local women. That just felt like a really interesting space to enter into. So it comes partly from, some thematic and intellectual interests, some artistic interests building on previous work, and some of that sort of familial connection.
I found it really interesting to read about Wales's role in the war, because it's something that we don't really hear about, even in Britain. It's something that was new to me, and I thought, how? But yes, it's good to read. On the nationalism things, the Welsh language, it seems that English is a second language for so many people back then. How far was this the case? If you can explain more about that.
It's funny, as a writer, although I only write in English and my foreign language skills are very minimal, I'm the child of two parents who were both speakers of English as a second language. My mother grew up in Malaysia, and so even though she was schooled in English, in the home, she spoke Chinese, of course. And I think my father, very much also grew up as a Welsh speaker, although also, of course, fluent in English. What's sort of weird to me now and noticeable, I think, is that, as a kid growing up, when friends would come over to visit and hang out, it was my father's accent they had trouble passing out, I think, in various ways. So it was this consciousness, and I think he was conscious of a kind of otherness, maybe even more so oddly than my mother. I think he felt, even in his work and his job, that he was the Welsh one, right? There was a certain, I think he maybe even felt, if I would be exaggerating this a little bit, but maybe even slightly discriminated against us, the Welsh one and not the English one in the office in some ways too. So there was always a consciousness, I think, of that. And certainly as a child, when I would go back and visit family with my father in Wales, I would sit there quietly as a kid listening to everybody talking Welsh above my head, and I became a decent observer of body language, but I had no idea really what was being talked about in those spaces. So even then, for that generation, it was very much a living language. It's becoming so again through schooling and through changes in Wales since that time. The efforts to preserve the language have been more successful, I think, in the intervening years. But it really did feel like it was a vibrant language for that generation.
You say about, people having trouble with the accent. I'm going to say this Welsh word here, and I think I'm going to find the Chinese easier to pronounce. You've got the concept of cynefin.
Yeah, I think, and I'm not completely sure that my own pronunciation is great, that it's pronounced cynefin. Yeah, it sort of feels like it's Kevin with a stutter, cynefin. Yeah, so it's this idea. I mean, I should say there is, this is the concept that flocks of sheep know their territory, their patch on a mountainside. It's what enables a shepherd to let them loose on the mountainside, because they know they won't stray too far. Some of them occasionally, but mostly the flock will stay in one place or in a region that they know to be their territory. And that felt like an interesting metaphor to me. I think this is also true, I should say, of sheep farms elsewhere in Britain, I think in the Lake District or in the north. There's a term there is hefting, I believe, and it maybe derives from an Old English word, I'm not quite sure, but it describes the same concept. The flock and the sheep have this sense of their territory and their space.
Mm-hmm. We better move on to the fortunes. I have got a ton of questions here. I'm really hoping actually that through your answers to some of them, you answer some of the others.
Sure, okay. I'll do my best.
Yeah, please do. So, listeners, The Fortunes, I'm going to make this as brief as I can. This is a book comprising, it's effectively 4 novellas, but I'll ask you, Peter, in a minute on that, connected by the theme of authenticity and identity and passing in the context of being Chinese American. And the novellas take us from the mid-1800s to the present day. So, Peter, I have called them novellas, but you said earlier about, short stories and mixing in with novels and things.
Sure.
I think this is the time to talk about that.
Yeah, I think that's a fair comment. It hovers, I think, as a work on that borderline between a novel and something less traditional, kind of an assemblage of pieces, interlinked novellas. And I think I draw some of the aesthetic of that sense of how different separate pieces might bounce off each other, echo each other, speak back to each other, from the way I think about short story collections, where very often stories, albeit they may be with different protagonists, are often in a kind of conversation, a kind of dialogue with each other. I think it's one of the real pleasures in which the idea of a short story collection always can be more than the sum of its parts, I think, if it's operating in interesting ways. And so The Fortunes draws a little bit on some of those spaces as well. I struggle a little bit to characterize it, but I do think this idea, I'm very interested in this space of a kind of hybrid novel, and a lot of the works that I'm interested in reading and operate in that kind of space as well. What I would say is that not that this was fully in my mind as I was writing it. It's one of those sort of ad hoc understandings of one's own work that I think often happen for writers, actually. The book is very much about this Chinese American, or more broadly Asian American identity, which is itself a kind of hybrid identity, right? So there's a struggle about, do we lean more towards our Chinese heritage or towards assimilation to American communities? There are questions of loyalty associated with that space. Or can we think of ourselves as somehow both Chinese and American, right? So there's a combination there that the identity could be a hybrid identity in various ways. And in a strange way, the book, which is a novel composed of novellas that operate a little bit like a short story collection, is in itself a kind of hybrid form. So the uncertainty about the identity, the category, the genre of the book, I think echoes something of that identity questioning that the characters are grappling with in various ways as well. It's a hybrid book about hybrid identities.
Yeah, that's an interesting way of looking at it. I like that. So I'm going to ask a kind of general question first. In the early days, why did Chinese people emigrate to America?
Well, there are a couple of motivations for that I'm interested in the first part of the book. The first, sort of famously, is for the gold rush. It's what brought a lot of people to California, including Chinese people seeking to make their fortune in the US. The Chinese experience of the gold rush is a pretty difficult one. They were often runoff claims, at gunpoint by white settlers. So there was existing tensions between white settlers and Chinese gold miners in that period as well. The phase that I'm interested in, though, comes just a few years after the gold rush, as it begins to ebb a little bit, is the period of the building of the Transcontinental Railroad, which happens just after the end of the Civil War in the US. And it's a really nation-building activity. It's a remarkable civil engineering feat, if nothing else, to sort of stitch the country back together. And I do tend to think of the railway tracks as almost like the stitching over a scar. This country that's almost been torn apart, north and south, is now being stitched together east to west in a strange way by having this railroad built all the way across it through very inhospitable terrain in various ways. And of course, one part of the railroad building is taking place moving from the east, or really the Midwest at that point, towards the West Coast, and the other set of rails is being built from the West Coast towards the middle of the country. They're eventually going to meet up at Promontory Point in Utah. And of course, from the eastern side, there's a lot of immigrant labor involved, a lot of Irish labor involved in building the railroad from the east towards the west. And from the west towards the east, and a lot of that Chinese immigrant labor, some of which are the Chinese workers who come to the gold fields and are displaced from the gold fields, they sign on eventually to help build the railroad. But in fact, the demand for labor is so great that, there are advertisements for Chinese laborers to work on the railroad sent back to China. So thousands more Chinese immigrate to the US to work on the railroad. So there's a way in which the railroad work feels as though it begins to cement and augment the immigration of Chinese. And because at this point it's nearly all men, they're coming to do labor. It's a bachelor society, as it's often described. It's one of the things that cements the arrival of Chinese in the US. And yet again, as the book begins to suggest, once the railroad work is completed, those men are thrown out of work. There's, again, sort of labor disputes, competition for work between them and white workers. So it's still a very challenged and difficult experience for those immigrant men.
You talk about the early days and women, and if we say story one is about Ling, he's a Gold Mountain Eurasian immigrant who begins as a laundryman in San Francisco. So the women who come over, one of the characters is a prostitute, and there are a lot of women in that position. They can't do the labour that the men can do. When did things improve for women?
Oh, well, so there are sort of missionary groups in San Francisco that begin to pull women, Chinese women, out of these terrible, we talk about prostitution. I think when we think about Western movies, there's a kind of image we have, a kind of bordello. But these were almost slave conditions that some of these women were operating in. The cribs that they were based in were incredibly grim. So it was a servitude that was very dark. I think the portions of male to female Chinese immigrants, I think there was one woman for every 20 male Chinese immigrants. So while I wanted to tell the story of the men, and I'm interested in the story of men essentially in some ways without women, I was also wanting to talk about the darkness, the grimness of the lives of these women as well. And so I wanted to have two of those things going on at the same time in the context of the narrative. But yeah, so things very slowly begin to improve for them as time goes on. Partly, as I say, through some missionary work that goes on in San Francisco in that period.
Mm-hmm. So during the first story in the book, there's a little bit that describes chinoiserie, the interpretation and imitation of Chinese decoration and furnishings. How widespread was that? And was there ever a point when actual Chinese decorations took over?
It's funny because I think there's a fashion for, and we see these fashions to this day, I suppose. We're always interested in the new or the fresh or the exotic or something that comes from somewhere else. And one of the great ironies, I think, is that there was a kind of vogue for things Chinese in the US. I think this is true in Britain as well, that precedes really the arrival of actual Chinese people into the US. So, fairly close to where I live in Michigan right now, there is a town called Canton. I think locally it's pronounced Canton, because I think in a way that's a suggestion of the way that the Chinese roots of that has sort of been forgotten in various ways. And as I think I mentioned a little bit later in the Fortunes, there are towns in the US named Canton across the country in different states along the way, right? All over the place. There's probably half a dozen of them, if not more. And many of them were named before Chinese immigrants had even arrived in the US. So there's a sense of it's fashionable, it's exotic, it's this new thing. We'll embrace these things. And I think that goes for some of the goods from China. But once we actually meet these Chinese people and they start to compete with us for jobs, or we have to live alongside them, then suddenly that tide begins to turn in various ways. So it's odd that the objects or the image is more valued than the reality.
Mm-hmm. I looked it up briefly just to know that it was in my head. Everything is as it was. And I thought straight away, Brighton Pavilion.
Yeah, sure. Right. Yeah, you only have to watch a couple of episodes of Antique Roadshow, I think, before you see some instances begin to emerge.
Oh, you're reminding me of going back to school now, Sunday nights, oh dear. The second story in the book features a fictionalized Anna May Wong, who was a real-life actor who struggled to get good roles in the early film years on account of her ethnicity. No surprise. You have a reading from the book from this section for us.
Yeah, sure. This is a little passage from her when she's young and sort of beginning to fall in love with the movies. So this section is called Darkness Invisible. She bought her first movie ticket at 10 with the tips she earned making deliveries for her father's laundry. This was Los Angeles, Losang in Chinese, her birthplace. Cutting school, she walked for miles in the heat to avoid being seen by anyone she knew. Only when she hadn't passed another Chinese face for blocks did she duck into a theater, a biograph, she later recalled. The ticket seller gave her a narrow look, inspected the Indian head on the coin she held out as if it were a passport, this when Nickelodeons still cost a nickel, and waved her through. The ticket stub is preserved on the inside cover of her scrapbook. At first, she felt self-conscious being the only Chinese and a young girl at that in the audience. She hid in the bathroom, terrified and lonely, tracing the pattern on the tin ceiling till she heard the organist start up, and then she slipped in and took a seat. But in the cool darkness, she found herself relaxing, laughing with the rest of the short subjects, weeping with everyone else during the feature, emotions she would never have betrayed on the street, which even here she glanced furtively around before giving vent to. But no one was watching her. All their faces upturned toward the screen, each one lit with the same silvery glaze. No one, not even she, could tell the difference. It was the first place she felt like an American. When he found out, her father made her kneel and beat her with the broom. But she kept going, sometimes seeking out movie houses so far from home that the intertitles were in Spanish. Pearl White in The Perils of Pauline was a favorite, perils that included villains called Wu Fang and Long Sin. Her own villainy included forging notes from her father to give to her teachers in an English he couldn't write, getting whipped first by him and then by them when discovered. In the beginning, it was the theatre's thrill of invisibility that she craved, that she couldn't get enough of, tired as she was of being stared at in the street, picked on in school. Outside, even the sun seemed to glare at her. Inside, it was all chill shadows. The flickers were the one place she didn't feel watched, the one place where she could watch others. Later, though, when she came to envy those faces and figures on the screen before her, not to be stared at was one thing, but to be stared at as they were stared at, with love and awe, was something else again. She wanted to be like them. Every face on the screen was white, but in the dreaming darkness, anything seemed possible. At home, in the mirror, she practiced their expressions and poses awkwardly, but in the dark, she made their faces her own.
Is it possible to give us sort of a brief overview of her journey in the industry, so to speak?
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's interesting because in a strange way, she is human living chinoiserie, right? She becomes famous for being Chinese and exotic. And she gets roles because of that. So she is successful because she is who she is, but there are also limitations on what she's allowed to do or be in the film industry. So, that exoticism is captured, I think, in, her first big role is in The Thief of Baghdad from Douglas Fairbanks Sr. It's a very glamorized, exoticized, sort of scandalous role because she's incredibly scantily clad in those movies. So she's something of a kind of sex siren in that era, in those periods, and becomes very famous. I mean, she's voted best dressed woman in the world at certain points. She's a major Hollywood celebrity in various ways. But the great limitation upon her is that she can't move beyond those kind of glamorized, exoticized roles, partly because of the mores of the day and also the rules of the film industry. She can't kiss an actor of another race, so she can never really play a romantic lead and play a leading lady. In most of her roles, there are very few Asian actors, and even though many Asian roles are played by white actors in yellowface, so she does notionally play alongside male characters who are supposed to be Chinese, because they're white actors, she's still not allowed to kiss them. So there's an incredible kind of trap here that she finds herself in. So the kind of roles offered to her, the Madame Butterfly characters or these sort of evil temptress characters in various ways. There's also very stereotypical roles in various ways. And so beyond a certain point of her career, she finds herself getting very stalled in her progression. And all this comes to a head when Pearl Buck's The Good Earth is being made into a movie. This is going to be a huge Hollywood production. The book, has been a big bestseller. Pearl Buck has won the Nobel Prize. It's going to be a huge deal. It's sort of like, I suppose, in a way, the way we might think about a movie like Gone with the Wind and the casting drama around a movie like that, the buzz around it. And so Anna May Wong has been rumored for years. She's the perfect person to play the lead role in the movie, but she doesn't get it. In fact, a German actress, Louise Rainier, ends up playing the part in Yellowface, ends up winning an Oscar for playing the role. And I think for Anna May Wong, this is a moment of deep disillusionment with the process with Hollywood. And so I'm catching her, although the sequence moves around in time through her childhood and later years. But the main action of that sequence is sort of the aftermath of that rejection when, despite the fact that she's born in Los Angeles, lived all of her life in the US and in Europe, actually, where she also had something of a film career, she decides at that point, I'm going to take a trip back, since she's never been there before, I'm going to take a trip to China. And I mean, in a sense, to connect with her roots. And she actually goes with a newsreel cameraman. She's going to sort of film herself on tour in China. It feels like it's a psychological riposte to being rejected by Hollywood in various ways. And yet the deep and painful irony of this experience is that when she arrives in China, she's not received to universal acclaim because there's a kind of rejection of the stereotypical roles that she's played for Hollywood. There's a kind of unease, and in some cases downright disgust with the roles that she has chosen to take in Hollywood, that she's proven to be a problematic representative of the Chinese, to Chinese audiences at least.
You mentioned The Good Earth there. I know I've read that she hadn't been picked a while back. And then reading your book was the first time I'd found out that actually the author had wanted a Chinese American cast. And it's just like absolutely bonkers. Understand it in context, but still.
Yeah, I think in fact the one role she was offered, I think, or tested for in The Good Earth was the role of the kind of villainess. And she was like, the one evil character in this book is going to be played by the one person who's genuinely Chinese. I think she found that to be also kind of very problematic and quite offensive. So, we talk a lot about these issues of casting today. It's sort of shocking that some of these issues still persist. But she's a historical forerunner of many of these questions that are still with us, unfortunately.
Which film would you recommend if people wanted to look into Anna May Wong? Which one would you go for?
Oh, that's a great question. I mean, I do think The Thief of Baghdad is a pretty remarkable movie.
And it's in the public domain, I believe, isn't it? So
I believe that's true, yeah. So I think that would be a reasonable place to start, partly because I think it's tricky to watch movies like that from our moment, and difficult because they are, of course, trading in, well, let's put it kindly and say exoticism. If we were to think about it less kindly, it would be Orientalism and maybe even downright racial stereotyping. And yet, her screen presence, the glow of her, there's something incandescent about that, which I think does say something about, yes, she was and could have been a huge star in many ways. So there's something about that, the promise of that I think is sort of worth thinking about. A later movie that I think is also available, and I think is in some ways a more interesting and maybe more accessible drama because it's talky and it has recognizable stars in it as well, is Shanghai Express, which has Marlene Dietrich in it as well. And it's a talking role for Anna May, and it's very charged, very dramatic. So that might also be an option for people to check out.
So, story 3, we hear from a fictionalized friend of Vincent Chin. Vincent Chin was a factual person. He was a Chinese American in the 80s who was killed by white men because he looked Japanese, as it goes. This was a new story to me, probably as a British person. Is it well known in America?
It is somewhat well known because I live near Detroit where this terrible sort of hate crime took place in the early 80s. But oddly, I had heard about it when I was a teenager in Britain. I'm probably a few years younger than Vincent would have been at that time. But, I grew up in Coventry. It's car country, car industry. Early 80s is a period when that industry is really struggling with foreign imports, struggling from mismanagement, struggling economically in all kinds of different ways. So, my experience of growing up there was knowing at least one or two friends whose fathers were in the car business and whose jobs were definitely in jeopardy. And the whole town, I think, and that whole region, Birmingham as well, was feeling those pressures of layoffs. And you could feel the recession biting through the erosion of the car business. And so a lot of that was going on in Detroit at the same time. And so I feel like I was aware of the story of Vincent Chin, who's really killed out of that economic anxiety of white workers feeling as though Japanese imports are taking our jobs. We see this Asian person, we think he's Japanese, we're going to take it out on him, we're going to get into a fight on those grounds with him. And of course, I was writing this in 2015 or so, and in the Trump years, that history feels as though it's come closer and closer to our present in very disturbing ways. I wish the piece were not quite as timely as it now feels like it is. But now, actually, when I'm touring with the book or invited to give readings, that's often the section that I read because it feels, despite the fact that it took place 40 years ago, it feels incredibly timely. As to whether it's remembered or not, there are some documentaries. There was actually a documentary that was up for the Academy Award many years ago about the case. It's been touched on in a lot of histories of Asian American political mobilization. It's often thought of as a kind of catalyzing event in Asian American political consciousness that drew together Chinese and Japanese, because of course Vincent is Chinese, but is mistaken for Japanese. So these two communities, which are often historically have had some tensions going back to the war, of course, and before, but they're brought together around this case and sort of mobilize around it. So there is a memory. There was a documentary interviewing younger Asian Americans. A documentary was called Who Was Vincent Chin? And so there's a question of, do we as a community remember his case? But truthfully, I feel like I was writing it more for white readers to try and remember that circumstance, because I think in that sense it sort of dropped off the radar. Although, as I say, sadly now feels like it's a little bit more on the radar than it was before.
I was going to ask about the knock-on effect. That's good to hear. It started something. There are 4 stories, so we'll move on to the last one, although they are all important. So we've got is it completely fictional, I think, John?
Yes. So we've been touching on the fact that the protagonists of all of the first 3 sections or the characters are often historical figures. And that's sort of deliberate. I was interested in this idea of, in some ways, iconic figures or significant figures in Chinese American history, people who are at tipping points, people who are the first of their kind in various ways, in some instances, some happily, some more tragically. And so all of them are struggling, I think, with issues of representation. How do I, if I'm Anna May Wong, as first Chinese American movie star, how do I represent my people? What's the burden of that? What's the responsibility of that? And she's grappling with essentially the impossibility of one person standing for many, right? Which I think is a fundamental difficulty of her situation. And the other characters, I think, fall into some of those categories, have something in common with that. What I realized as I was writing about all of them is that anxiety, how does one speak for many, or how is one interpreted as many, is a novelistic question, or at least a question for writers of color very often, right? I know writers here who I'm friends with who are, first Korean American novelist, first such and such novelist. And I think that can both be a boon, but can also be a challenge and a burden in various ways. And while I don't think of myself falling into those categories, I guess I'm first Sino-Gallic writer, but I'm not sure that really counts for very much. I am conscious of that odd space of, how do I represent a community that I'm part of? How do I claim to represent that? Since because of my mixed race ancestry, I'm only ever half of something, or only have a limited claim to something. How do the people in those communities feel about being represented by me? So I thought, given that all my characters struggle with that, it would be fair to create a fictionalized version of myself, and I want to stress the fictionalized part of that.
I thought so. I thought there might be a bit in there, yes.
Yeah, so I'm figuring out that I've already, as a writer, been projecting onto my earlier characters some of those anxieties, and now I'm kind of fessing up to that and saying, well, okay, these are also rightly anxieties, and I will grant this in a kind of distorted, exaggerated, slightly self-satirical vision onto John, who's an Asian American writer, a struggling one. I mean, when I write about figures who bump into my autobiography, there's a kind of evil twin quality to that. And so you're imagining an exaggerated, extrapolated version of oneself who is struggling with some of one's worst fears. And so he has some things in common with me, but usually takes them a little bit further than my own experience, I think.
I did wonder that, because I was reading it, and when he name dropped, I suppose, from the other stories, and I thought, there's a bit of Peter here as well. That was interesting.
Yeah, I mean, it's a way of drawing the book together. There are a lot of links and connections and echoes, but there's definitely a sense in which John is thinking back on the previous work. So there's a way in which the book is becoming sort of self-conscious of itself in a way, which felt right as that moved towards the close of the book. I think a lot of books actually in writing or in revision grow into an understanding of themselves. And so there's something of that being dramatized in that last section. And there are lots of little small details that were fun to write. That's where John and my biographies bump up against each other. I think he talks at one point about entertaining the idea or the contract of writing novelizations of the Kung Fu TV series. And that was a gig that I was offered many, many years ago when I was starting out as a writer. Never took it up, mostly I think for good reasons, but it was fun to sort of begin to imagine thinking about that again from his point of view.
Uh-huh. So, a very low stakes question. In three of the stories, well, yeah, I think it is, but at the same time, it might be interesting. I want to hear your answer. You've
Sure.
got two people who are mentioned together in each of the three stories. They're not really characters. Zhen and Jia. Is there a link there?
Oh, now, that's very interesting. I'm sure there is. And I wish I could remember what it was at this point. But, in an effort and a desire to persuade myself and maybe my editors and maybe readers that this was a novel, I should say, to back up just a little bit, that when I signed the contract to write this book, the idea, the pitch was, this is a novel about Chinese working to build the Transcontinental Railroad. And I thought that would be the whole book. And I had a lot of that planned out. And what I ran into, and one of the reasons the book sort of slowed down and I got stuck for a while, is that by the end of what's now the first section, the only section on the Transcontinental, my protagonist is sort of making a decision, I think, to step out of the limelight. He's sort of saying, I'm done with being part of history now, which to some degree is him saying, I'm done with being part of your novel now. I'm done with the representing now. And I think the character is making the right choice for the character. It feels like an ethical choice. It feels like the choice he's built towards through that narrative. And I respect it, although for quite a long time I resented it because I kept trying to push him back into the limelight. I'm not done with you now. Another 200 pages out of you, buddy. And so there was probably a period there of a year or 18 months of just sort of struggling to push beyond that space before I recognized that narrative had arrived at a kind of organic end point. And then, of course, you have to start thinking about, well, is this a novel yet? Well, apparently my editors at that time did not think so. So I had to come up with something else. And, there's a long story here. I ended up moving publishing houses, which in many ways was liberating because I could go to new houses and pitch a different vision of the book, which had begun to evolve. I'd been interested in the Anna May Wong story for a while. And so there's a long and sort of convoluted evolution. But somewhere in the back of that, there's always that part of me thinking, I'm supposed to be writing a novel. Is it collapsing back into something that looks more like a collection of stories? And I don't believe that's the case. I mean, I do feel like it's a non-traditional novel, but it feels very much like a novel to me. I actually often compare it to, oddly, I compare it often to multi-generational novels. We're used to that for immigrant novels, right? The book that covers, 100 years or so in American history starts with an Italian grandparent arriving at Ellis Island, and we see them, living their hard-scrabble lives in New York and maybe getting mob connections. And then really, that's The Godfather, right? In a strange way, right? But there's a whole history of immigrant novels that do that 2 or 3 generation thing and look at a way a family, patriarchs and matriarchs arrive, and then we have descendants and we move through different generations. But partly because of the nature of Chinese American immigration, partly because it's largely a bachelor society at one end, partly because, and one of the reasons, for the last section being interested in the adoption of Chinese babies, that's oddly a wave of immigration that is all female. So you've got this bachelor society at one end, you've got this wave of female immigration in a strange way through the adoption of Chinese babies at the other end, and partly because, of the anti-miscegenation laws that meant that Anna May Wong not only couldn't kiss a white man on screen, she also couldn't marry one, for instance. The idea for a Chinese American novel in which there's a simple generational, they'll be grandparents and they will have children who will become the parents of the generation after that, felt more complicated. So in a strange way, this is a version of a multi-generational novel in which the generations are not linked by blood, but by theme and experience. And so as I was pulling the book together, I was really interested in trying to pick out some of those echoes and themes. I find that fun as a reader myself, to see the way little bits of language pop in different places. So there's lots of echoes of imagery running through the book, some of which came naturally, some of which I sort of seeded back into the book as I was going along, some of which sort of emerged from just what I was writing. It felt like these odd moments where the material was just inspiring in those ways. But I think those names are part of that construction of, I'm going to put some of these threads into the text for a reader to notice and think about. What I'm vaguely remembering at the back of my mind, and because I'm a few years old now, and I'm also, my headspace is in that space of a new novel now, is that those names, if one were to look them up, might have a certain resonance. But it's also that odd way in which there is a kind of if not a blood link, there's these echoes taking place through the generations. That's part of the intention. That was a good spot, though. And in a way, I want to encourage that in readers. Right? I like it as a reader. I like it in my readers to be reading closely, to look at those little stitches that are holding this bag of words together in a way.
I get a medal.
Yeah, right. Gold star.
Good. That's the most important thing. Right. So, Peter, on a different subject now. If one searches for your name on Amazon, there's a book attributed to you for January next year. And I'm not going to say the title because it could be seen as part of my question.
Oh, sure, yeah. Well, so the title is A Lie Someone Told You About Yourself. And it's a very short novel and it should come out, I think, in very early January. I think maybe January the 5th is the pub date, either in the US or the UK. Either way, it'll come out on either side of the Atlantic within a couple of days.
So this is a novel as opposed to the short stories, say?
It is a novel. It is a very short novel, only a couple of hundred pages, I think. It's more contemporary. It's more personal. It leans a little into that auto-fictional space. Some of the stuff that I'm beginning to dabble in a little bit towards the end of that last section, the fortunes, is carried over a little bit into this new one.
Mm-hmm. So, listeners, The Welsh Girl and the Fortunes are available now, and do look out for Peter's next book. Links are in the description. If you've enjoyed this conversation, do subscribe for future episodes, and if you'd like to contact the show, email address is in the description. Peter, this has been great. I've really enjoyed talking to you, and I've learned a lot, and I hope that listeners will too. Thank you very much, and looking forward to your new book.
Thank you. It's been a great pleasure, Jai. Thanks for asking me on.
Join me on Monday, the 14th of September, when I will be talking to Midge Raymond, author of Forgetting English and My Last Continent. The Wormhole Podcast, episode 21, was recorded on the 7th of August and published on the 24th of August, 2020. Music and production by Charlie Place.